He didn't even look up from his phone when she told him she needed to talk. Ryan Blackwell sat across from his wife at a dinner table set for two, his eyes locked on a Tokyo market report, his fork moving mechanically from plate to mouth. And when Emma said, "Ryan, I have something important. Please, just look at me for 1 minute," he checked his watch instead. Then he said, without raising his eyes, "Can it wait until after Singapore? I closed the Meridian deal Friday, and I can't afford distractions right now." She never brought it up again. 3 months later, she filed for divorce. He signed the papers the same afternoon between a conference call and a flight to Seoul. He thought that was the end of the story. He was wrong. If this story already has your heart, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. The hospital corridor at 3 in the morning had a particular kind of silence that Emma Hayes had come to know well. Not peaceful, not restful. The silence of people holding their breath, the silence of parents in waiting rooms staring at tile floors, counting grout lines, doing anything to keep their minds from going where their minds kept trying to go. Emma had been a pediatric nurse for 9 years. She knew this silence from the other side, the competent side, the clipboard and stethoscope side. She'd held the hands of mothers in this corridor. She'd delivered news, good and bad, in a voice trained to stay level when everything inside her was anything but. She knew every bathroom on the floor. She knew which vending machine jammed on the third button. She knew the name of the overnight janitor, Marcus, who always left a paper cup of bad coffee outside the nurses' station at 2 a.m. because he said night shift nurses deserved something warm even if it tasted like boiled cardboard. She had never imagined she would learn this corridor from the mother's side. But here she was, room 14, pediatric cardiac unit, 3rd floor. Her son was 4 months old and his heart was trying to kill him. Ethan James Hayes had been born on a Tuesday in late October, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples and eyes that couldn't decide between gray and green. He had a dimple on his left cheek that appeared even when he wasn't fully smiling, just sort of considering whether to smile, which he did often. He was, by any measure that mattered to Emma, the most extraordinary person she had ever met. He had also been born with a congenital heart defect, a critical combination that the cardiologist, Dr. Patricia Nguyen, had explained in careful, measured language, while Emma sat in an office chair and tried to process words like hypoplastic and ventricular and surgical intervention as if they were being said to someone else, in another room, in another life. Emma was a nurse. She understood the terminology. That made it worse, not better. For the first 3 months, Ethan had been home with her. They had a system. Emma had taken a leave of absence. The hospital, St. Catherine's Medical Center, had been more than accommodating, which was both kind and quietly devastating, because it confirmed that everyone understood the seriousness of what they were dealing with. She lived in the apartment she'd rented after the divorce, a 2-bedroom place in the Riverside district with a window in the nursery that faced east, so Ethan got morning light, because she'd read that morning light was good for newborns, and she'd held on to that small controllable thing with both hands. She had a monitor, she had a schedule, she had a protocol for his medications, his feeding, his sleeping position, the precise angle of the crib mattress that kept his breathing easiest. She had her mother flying in from Phoenix every 3rd week. She had her colleague and closest friend, Dana Reyes, who appeared at her door every Saturday morning with grocery bags and the specific kind of company that didn't require conversation. What she did not have was help from Ethan's father. Not because Ryan Blackwell wasn't capable of helping. He was, she supposed, capable of most things he decided to apply himself to. He had built Blackwell Capital from a 2-man operation in a rented office in downtown Chicago into one of the most aggressive private equity firms on the Eastern Seaboard. He was 38 years old, and his name appeared on financial pages with the kind of regularity that meant something in those circles. He was capable of focus and determination and the specific ruthlessness that certain kinds of success required. He simply didn't know Ethan existed. That was Emma's choice, and she had made it with full awareness of what it meant. She'd turned it over 100 times in the weeks after she'd seen those 2 faint lines on the test, sitting on the edge of the bathtub in the apartment they'd still been sharing then, 4 years ago. She'd sat there for a long time. Then she'd gotten up and made herself dinner and thought about it some more. She'd decided to tell him. She'd been sure about that. Whatever was broken between them, and there was a great deal broken between them by that point, Things that had cracked so long ago and so quietly that neither of them had noticed until the cracks ran all the way through. A baby changed the equation. She believed that. She'd planned the conversation. She'd even written some things down, not because she needed notes, but because the act of writing steadied her, and she was not steady. The night she'd intended to tell him, Ryan had come home at 10:30 from a dinner she hadn't been invited to, loosening his tie in the doorway with the particular energy of a man who'd been performing all evening and was now dropping the performance. He'd poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and sat on the couch and said, without any special emphasis, as if he were mentioning the weather, "Thorne's pushing me to relocate the Asia operations to Singapore. I told him I'd think about it. I'm not thinking about it. I'm doing it. We'll be based there 6 months out of the year, starting Q2. Emma had been sitting across from him. She'd had the words ready. I'm pregnant. She hadn't said them. Because Ryan had kept talking. About the Singapore deal, about the timeline, about how this would change some things, but not really change things. Not for her. Because she was adaptable. She'd always been adaptable. That was one of the things he admired about her. And somewhere in that monologue, she'd heard something she'd been hearing for 2 years, but had never let herself name directly. He wasn't asking her. He wasn't consulting her. He was informing her, the way you inform the people in your life who are important, but not central, who matter, but don't get a vote. And then he'd said, reaching for his phone, glancing at a message, "Kids would have made all of this impossible. I know we talked about it when we first got married, but honestly, I think we both know this isn't the life for that. We're not the right people for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever." She'd sat very still. He hadn't looked up from his phone. She'd gone to bed without saying anything. And the next morning, she'd called her mother, and 2 weeks after that, she'd called a divorce attorney, and she had never once told Ryan Blackwell that she was carrying his son. Was it the right call? She'd asked herself that question so many times it had worn smooth, like a worry stone. In her clearest moments, she thought she'd protected Ethan from a father who would have turned his presence into a scheduling problem, who would have fit fatherhood into the margins of his calendar the way he fit everything personal into the margins. Obligatory, somewhat inconvenient, managed. She'd given her son a mother who showed up completely. That was something. In her less clear moments, 3 a.m., moments exactly like this one. She thought about what Ethan might need that she couldn't give him. Bone marrow, a kidney, a compatible blood type for a transfusion. All the biological realities that didn't care about her reasons. A compatible heart. Dr. Nguyen had used the word transplant 10 days ago. Not immediately, she had said. They would try to manage with medication and monitoring first. They would see how he responded. But Emma had been a nurse long enough to read the careful language underneath the clinical language. They were buying time. They were hoping the time they bought would be enough. Ethan had been admitted to the cardiac unit 4 days ago when his oxygen saturation had dropped suddenly during what should have been an ordinary Tuesday evening. Emma had been changing him. He'd gone gray. Not pale. Gray. And she'd already had her phone in her hand dialing before she was fully conscious of deciding to dial. The paramedics had told her she'd done everything right. She hadn't felt like she'd done anything right. She felt like she'd been standing next to something terrible and moving too slowly. Now it was 3 a.m, and she was sitting in the chair beside his incubator. They'd upgraded to a proper crib with monitoring leads attached, doctor. Nguyen had explained the various alarms and what each meant and which ones should make her press the call button and which ones were normal fluctuation, and Emma had memorized all of it the way she memorized things under pressure, completely and without peace. And she had Ethan against her chest because the attending nurse, a young woman named Priya, who had been unfailingly gentle, had said skin contact was good for him, that they encouraged it even with the leads, that his vitals actually stabilized when Emma held him. So Emma held him. He was so small against her. 4 months old, small for his age, and his breathing was doing the thing it sometimes did at night, this slightly labored quality that she'd learned to gauge by watching the movement of his chest, the rise and fall, counting. She counted. She always counted. She counted the way other people prayed, with that same focused desperation, as if the repetition itself could hold something in place. She was not aware of anything outside this room. This was the only room. This was the only world. Ryan Blackwell stepped off the elevator on the third floor of St. Catherine's Medical Center at 3:14 in the morning and immediately felt the particular irritation of a man who did not want to be where he was. He owned this hospital. That was not entirely accurate. Blackwell Capital had acquired a 63% controlling interest in the St. Catherine's health system 11 months ago as part of a broader healthcare portfolio strategy, which meant Ryan owned it the way a person owns anything through financial instruments, which was thoroughly and somewhat abstractly. He had never actually been inside this building before tonight. He'd seen the financials. He'd sat through presentations with the administrative team. He'd approved the capital improvement budget for the new surgical wing and the parking structure. He had not walked these corridors or smelled the specific combination of antiseptic and recycled air and something faintly floral that he suspected came from a cleaning solution. He was doing so now because Marcus Webb, the hospital's CFO, had called him at 11 p.m. with an issue involving the third-floor cardiac unit's equipment procurement that apparently could not wait until morning, or at least Marcus had presented it that way, and Ryan had agreed to come in rather than deal with it by phone because he was in the car anyway, coming from a dinner that had gone poorly, and because some part of him had learned over the years that the problems people claimed couldn't wait until morning frequently couldn't, and showing up was occasionally the difference between managing a problem and inheriting a catastrophe. He dealt with the CFO. It had taken 40 minutes and would probably be fine. Now he was walking back toward the elevator with his jacket over one arm and his phone in his hand, scrolling through the accumulated messages of an evening he'd only partially attended, and he rounded the corner of the corridor and slowed without entirely deciding to slow. Through the glass panel of room 14, softly lit from within, he saw a woman sitting in a chair beside a hospital crib. She had her back partially to him. She was holding an infant against her chest, the infant's face turned toward the room, small and sleeping, connected to a web of monitoring equipment by leads that caught the light. The woman was bent slightly forward over the child, and she was very still, and there was something about the quality of her stillness, not peace, not rest, something more like the stillness of someone standing at the edge of something enormous and refusing to step back, that made Ryan stop completely. He stood there for a moment that he couldn't have measured. Then she shifted slightly, and he saw her face. The recognition was not gradual. It was instantaneous and physical, like a cold hand laid flat on his chest. Emma. Emma Hayes, who had been Emma Blackwell for 4 years, and who had been, before that, a woman he'd met at a charity fundraiser on a rainy Wednesday evening in November and thought was the most quietly self-possessed person he'd encountered in a long time. Emma, who had dark hair that she kept pulled back and eyes that were dark brown or very dark green depending on the light, who had a way of listening that made you feel slightly interrogated and entirely heard at the same time. Emma, who had sat across from him at that dinner table and asked him to look at her, and he had looked at his watch instead. Emma, who had walked out of his life 3.5 years ago and whom he had not permitted himself to think about with any consistency since, because permitting it had not seemed useful, and Ryan Blackwell was, at his core, a man who organized himself around what was useful. She was holding an infant, a newborn, or close to it, small enough. He could see a tuft of dark hair above the edge of the blanket Emma had wrapped around him, pressed there against her chest, dark hair that curled slightly at the temples. Ryan stood in the corridor and the arithmetic assembled itself without his permission. He did not want it to assemble itself. He stood very still, and the numbers came together anyway, the way numbers always did for him, cleanly and without mercy. 4 months old, maybe 5. The timeline would put conception. He put his hand flat against the corridor wall. He had not actually touched the wall. He was standing straight, phone in hand, jacket over arm. From the outside, he probably looked like a man who had paused to check a message. But something inside him had lurched sideways in a way he had not experienced in a very long time and could not immediately categorize. He needed to leave. He was going to leave. He would walk to the elevator, call his driver, go home, and examine what he'd just seen in the morning when he was in possession of his full analytical capacity. He did not leave. He stood in the corridor watching Emma hold her child, and for reasons he couldn't have defended in any room he normally occupied, a boardroom, a negotiation, a conversation with anyone who knew him, he could not make himself walk away. Emma heard the door. She turned her head, and there was a moment, a fraction of a second, when she saw the silhouette in the doorway and her brain simply refused to process it. The shape was wrong for this room. This room contained doctors and nurses and her mother on alternating weeks and Dana on Saturdays. It did not contain Emma. His voice was the same, lower, maybe, than she'd reconstructed it in her memory, more uncertain, which she had not expected. She did not move. She was aware of Ethan against her chest, his weight, his breathing, the fine tremor of his pulse that she could feel through the blanket. She kept one hand flat against his back, the way she always did, measuring. "Ryan," she said. It came out level. She was grateful for 9 years of clinical training. He was in the doorway, not quite in the room. He looked. She registered this involuntarily, the way you register information you don't want. Tired. Not the polished tired of a man who worked long hours by choice, but something rawer than that. His jacket was over one arm. His tie was loosened. He was looking at her, and then his eyes moved to Ethan, and something happened in his face that she couldn't name and didn't want to examine. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice was still level. She was proud of that. He stopped. She watched him reconstruct whatever he'd been planning to say. "I have an interest in this hospital. The acquisition. Blackwell Capital acquired the St. Catherine's system last year. I was here for a meeting. At 3 in the morning. It ran late. The CFO had..." He stopped again. She could see him looking at Ethan. "Emma. Ryan. Is that..." He didn't finish the sentence. Emma felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with Ethan. A tectonic thing, slow and inevitable. She'd known, in the abstract, that this moment was possible. She'd even thought about what she would say, in the loose, half-hearted way you plan for disasters you're hoping won't materialize. She had not actually believed it would happen like this. 3 in the morning, her son attached to monitoring equipment, Ryan Blackwell in the doorway with his tie loose and his face doing something she couldn't read. "How old is he?" Ryan asked. "Ryan? How old is he, Emma?" She looked at him. She had been very still for a long time, and she was still now. 4 months, she said. She watched him do the math. She had done it herself many times. She knew exactly what the answer was. "Emma!" His voice had changed. Something had dropped out of it, some layer of composure she hadn't realized was there until it was gone. "Emma? Is he mine?" Ethan stirred against her chest. Just a small movement, the reflexive shift of a sleeping infant adjusting. But Emma felt it the way she felt everything about him these days, with her whole attention, every nerve oriented toward him. She pressed her palm more firmly against his back, and he settled. "This isn't the conversation I was planning to have tonight," she said. "I don't care what conversation you were planning." His voice was not loud. If anything, it had gotten quieter. "I'm asking you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer. Is he my son?" Emma looked at Ryan Blackwell standing in the doorway of this hospital room at 3 in the morning. She looked at Ethan, her son, their son, sleeping against her chest with his heart doing its imperfect, struggling, extraordinary work. "Yes," she said. "He is." Ryan took one step into the room and then stopped, as if a door had swung open in front of him and he wasn't sure the floor on the other side would hold. He looked at Ethan. Just looked at him, for a long moment, taking in the dark curl of hair at the temples, the small sleeping face, the monitoring leads, the soft rise and fall of his chest. "Why didn't you Not now." Emma's voice finally had an edge. "Not tonight. He's sick, Ryan. He's very sick. And I've been sitting in this room for 4 days holding it together, and I cannot have this conversation with you right now." "He's sick." Ryan's voice was flat in a way she recognized. It was the voice he used when he was working to keep something at bay, when information was coming too fast and he was processing. "What's wrong with him?" "Congenital heart defect, critical. He was admitted 4 days ago when his oxygen levels dropped." She kept her voice clinical. She needed the clinical voice. "He's stable right now. Dr. Nguyen is managing his care." "Patricia Nguyen?" She looked at him. "You know her?" "I know the name from the hospital review. She's one of the best in the state." He said it like he was trying to find something solid to stand on. "He's in good hands." "He's in good hands." Emma agreed, and the words came out steady, and she was very, very tired. Ryan stood in the middle of the room. He was looking at Ethan with an expression she didn't have a name for. It wasn't anything she'd seen on his face before. In 4 years of marriage, or in the year of decline that preceded the end of it, or in the brief, functional interactions they'd had since. It was not a face she knew how to read. "I'd like to stay," he said. "Just in the corridor. I won't bother you. You can sit," Emma said, and she didn't know why she said it. She hadn't decided to. "There's a chair over there." He sat in the chair against the wall, the one farthest from her and Ethan. He still had his jacket over his arm. He didn't say anything. He sat the way she'd been sitting for 4 days, with that particular stillness that wasn't peace. That was something else, something that had no good word for it in any language she knew. Emma turned back to Ethan. She adjusted her hold on him slightly, pressed her lips to the top of his head where the dark hair curled. She counted his breaths. She always counted. After a long time, Ryan said quietly, from the far chair, "His hair curls the same way mine did, in pictures, when I was a baby." Emma didn't answer, but she didn't ask him to leave either. By 5:30, the sky outside the window had gone from black to the deep blue of very early morning, not yet light, but with the light coming. Emma's mother had always called this hour the in-between time, the hour that belonged to no day in particular, that existed in the seam between what was and what was coming. Ethan was sleeping. His vitals on the monitor had stayed steady through the night. Dr. Wynne had told her that nights were often worse, that the relative stability of the past several hours was genuinely good, and Emma had been holding that information the way you hold something that might break. Ryan had gotten up twice, once to find coffee from the nurse's station, which he'd brought back without asking if she wanted any. She had taken it without asking why he'd brought 2 cups, and once to take a phone call in the corridor, brief and low-voiced, that she'd heard the murmur of without catching words. He'd come back both times and sat in his chair. They had not talked about anything important. She hadn't allowed it, and he seemed to understand that, or at least to accept it. Instead, he'd asked, at some point around 4 a.m., small things. How old the hospital was, whether Emma thought the overnight cafeteria was worth finding, whether Priya, the attending nurse, had been there a long time. He was doing the things she'd seen him do in new situations, cataloging, orienting. It was strange to watch from this angle. "You should probably go," Emma said finally. "You must have a morning. I have a 9 o'clock. He looked at his phone, then looked back at Ethan. "I have time." "Ryan," he met her eyes. "We do need to talk," she said. "Just not tonight. I know." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to make this harder than it already is. I just want you to understand that I'm not walking out of that door and disappearing." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the dinner table. She thought about the way he'd checked his watch. She thought about maybe not ever, and the bathtub, and the 2 lines on the test, and the piece of paper she'd started and never finished. "Okay," she said. It wasn't trust, it was barely anything, but it was what she had. Outside the window, the sky was moving. The in-between hour was ending, and the day was assembling itself, the way days did, without waiting for anyone to be ready. Ethan's chest rose and fell. Emma counted. Ryan left the hospital at 6:47 in the morning. Emma knew the exact time because she'd been watching the clock above the door the way she watched everything in that room, with the obsessive precision of someone who has learned that small details are the only things you can actually control. 6:47. The sky outside was fully light by then, pale and colorless the way early morning skies get in November. And Ethan had been sleeping steadily for almost 2 hours, his monitor readings holding in the range that Dr. Nguyen had told her to think of as acceptable, which was not the same as good, but was better than the alternative. Ryan had stood in the doorway before he left. He hadn't said anything dramatic. He'd looked at Ethan for a long moment, that same unreadable look he'd had for most of the night, the one she didn't have a category for. And then he'd looked at Emma and said, "I'll call you this afternoon, if that's all right." She'd said it was all right. She hadn't decided whether it was all right. She'd just said it because she was exhausted in a way that went past the point where decisions felt like decisions, and because some part of her understood that the conversation was coming regardless, and delaying it wasn't the same as preventing it. He'd nodded, Then he'd left, and she'd listened to his footsteps in the corridor until she couldn't hear them anymore. Dana arrived at 8:15 with a tote bag that contained, in no particular order, 2 decent coffees from the place 3 blocks over that Emma actually liked, a container of cut fruit that Emma would eat automatically without tasting, a clean change of clothes, and the particular kind of presents that asked no questions and required no performance. Dana Reyes had been Emma's closest friend since their first year of nursing school, when they'd been assigned to the same clinical rotation, and Emma had watched Dana calmly manage a code situation that had the rest of their cohort visibly rattled. They had been friends in the way that certain friendships form, not gradually, but suddenly, like a temperature change, and then permanently. Dana set the coffees on the small table by the window, looked at Ethan in his crib, looked at Emma in her chair, and said, "You didn't sleep." "No? How is he?" "Stable." Emma took the coffee. "Relatively." Dana sat in the chair that Ryan had occupied for most of the night. Emma noticed that she noticed this, the chair, its location, the jacket that was no longer draped over its arm, and she decided to tell Dana because Dana would find out anyway, and because keeping it from her would require energy Emma didn't have. "Ryan was here," she said. Dana went very still. "When?" "Last night. He owns the hospital. Blackwell Capital acquired it, apparently. He came in for a meeting and walked past the room and saw me through the glass." A long pause. "Does he know?" "He asked. I told him." Dana looked at her for a moment. Not with judgment. Dana was constitutionally incapable of the kind of reflexive judgment that most people defaulted to, but with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. "How did he react?" "I don't know how to describe it." Emma looked at Ethan. "He stayed until 6:40-something, just sat in that chair. He got me coffee at some point." "He got you coffee?" "From the nurse's station. It was terrible." Dana was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need from me right now?" This was why Emma loved her. Not, "What are you going to do?" or "Are you okay?" or "I can't believe this." Just the practical question, the one with a useful answer. "I need you to be here when he calls," Emma said. "This afternoon. I don't want to be alone when I have that conversation." "I'll be here," Dana said simply. "Akok." Ryan's 9 o'clock was a board call that he sat through in his car in the hospital parking structure because he hadn't gone home. He'd told his driver to park, and then he'd sat in the back seat and conducted 45 minutes of business in a voice that apparently sounded normal, because no one commented, because the people on that call had no way of knowing that Ryan Blackwell was sitting 3 blocks from a hospital room where his son, he was going to have to let that word actually land at some point, was sleeping with leads attached to his chest and a monitor measuring the performance of a heart that wasn't performing well enough. After the call ended, he sat in silence for a while. He was not a man who sat in silence. He was aware of this about himself. It was something Emma had pointed out once, not unkindly, that he was uncomfortable with quiet, that he filled it compulsively with work or noise or forward motion. She'd said it as an observation, not an accusation, in the early years when they'd still been talking honestly with each other, and he'd half acknowledged it and then moved on, which was, he now recognized, something of a demonstration of the point. He sat in silence in his car in the parking structure and thought about Ethan, dark hair that curled at the temples, small face, sleeping, the way Emma had held him, not like you hold something precious and fragile, which was what he'd expected, but with this matter-of-fact whole-body certainty, like a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has learned to carry it correctly. Like it was just part of how she was built now. 4 months. Maybe slightly more by now. 4 months that Ryan had not known existed, and before that 9 months he hadn't known about. And before that, the night Emma had sat across from him at that dinner and he'd been looking at his phone. He'd been looking at his phone and she'd said, "I need to talk to you," and he'd said, "Can it wait?" And apparently the answer had been that it could wait forever. He called his assistant, rescheduled his 10 o'clock, and called his attorney. Not because he was planning anything adversarial. He was clear on that at least. He called because he needed to understand where he stood legally and what his options were and what the right sequence of steps was, and legal counsel was how he oriented himself when the terrain was unfamiliar. His attorney, Carol Briggs, who had worked with him for 7 years and had heard most things, listened to the summary he gave her, and then said carefully, "Ryan, before we talk about legal options, I want to ask you something. What do you actually want here?" He didn't have an answer to that question yet. He told her he'd call her back. The conversation happened at 4 in the afternoon, not over the phone. Ryan had texted to ask if he could come to the hospital, and Emma had looked at Dana, and Dana had said, "Your call," and Emma had said yes. He brought better coffee this time, from the same place 3 blocks over, which he'd apparently found because Ryan Blackwell was nothing if not efficient. He brought one for Dana too, which surprised Emma in a way she didn't show. They sat in the small family consultation room down the hall from Ethan's room. A beige room with chairs that were trying to be comfortable and not quite succeeding, and a box of tissues on the table that no one touched. Priya was with Ethan. Emma had her phone face up on the table between them, Dr. Nguyen's number pulled up in case. Ryan sat across from Emma. Dana sat to Emma's left, which was not subtle, and Ryan acknowledged it with a look that said he understood the geometry of the room. "I want to hear it from you," Ryan said. "All of it, not just the facts, the why." Emma looked at her coffee cup. She'd been composing this for years in her head, the way you compose things you're hoping never to say out loud. It turned out that composing something silently and saying it to the person it concerned were 2 entirely different acts. "I was going to tell you," she said. "I want you to know that. I found out I was pregnant and I sat with it for about 2 weeks and I decided to tell you. I had the whole thing worked out in my head." "When?" His voice was controlled. She could hear the effort. "The night you told me about Singapore." She watched his face. "You came home from that dinner and you sat down and told me we were relocating, starting Q2, like it was already decided. No conversation, just, here's what's happening." A muscle moved in his jaw. "I remember that night. And then you said—" She stopped. She needed to say this exactly right, not to hurt him, though it was going to hurt him, but because the precision mattered. "You said you thought we'd both come to understand that we weren't the right people for kids, that the life we were living didn't have room for it." Ryan was very still. "You said it like you were reporting something we'd agreed on together," Emma said, "like it was a conclusion we'd both reached, but I had never agreed to that. You'd reached it, and you decided it applied to both of us, and you said it to my face while I was sitting there knowing I was pregnant with your child, and you were looking at your phone." The room was quiet. "Emma, I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I'm telling you because you asked for the why." She kept her voice even. It was costing her something, the evenness. "I sat there and I thought about what it would look like to tell you. I thought about you fitting Ethan into your schedule the way you fit everything personal into your schedule, quarterly, optimized, managed from a distance. I thought about my son spending his childhood understanding that he wasn't the most important thing, that he was a variable that got accommodated." She looked at him. "I didn't think that was a fair thing to do to a child." Ryan looked at the table. She watched him absorb this, not deflect it, which was what she'd expected, but actually absorb it, which was not something she'd seen from him very often, and which made this harder, not easier. "You should have told me anyway," he said. "That should have been my call too." "Yes," Emma said. "You're right, it should have been." He looked up. She thought he'd been expecting her to argue. "I made a decision that wasn't only mine to make," she said. "I know that. I've known it. I told myself I was protecting Ethan, and I was. And I was also protecting myself from a conversation I didn't think I had the strength for. And maybe I was punishing you a little. And I've had 3.5 years to sit with all of that, and I'm not proud of the parts that weren't about Ethan." She paused. "But I will not apologize for the parts that were." The silence stretched. Dana had not moved or said anything. Emma was aware of her presence the way you're aware of a wall at your back. Solid, undemanding, just there. Ryan turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I looked up his condition," he said. "Last night, after I left. Hypoplastic left heart syndrome with secondary complications. I read for about 3 hours." Emma blinked. "You read about it?" "I needed to understand it." He said it simply, not defensively. "He's going to need a transplant." "Possibly, doctor. Nguyen is managing it conservatively right now. We're monitoring. But yes, possibly. What's the timeline looking like? We don't know yet. His condition has been unpredictable. Some days are better than others. She stopped. Last Tuesday was not better. Something moved across his face. You were alone. My mother was in Phoenix. Dana was on shift. Emma's voice was level. I've been managing it. I know you have. He said it without the edge she'd been expecting. I'm not questioning your ability to manage it. He stopped and started again. I wasn't there. I should have been there, and I wasn't there. And I understand that the reason I wasn't there isn't simple, but he stopped again. He seemed to be working against the impulse to smooth this over, to make it neater than it was. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't cover it. I'm sorry anyway. Emma looked at him for a long moment. She was a good reader of people. 9 years of clinical work cultivated a certain accuracy about what people were actually doing versus what they appeared to be doing. Ryan Blackwell, in her experience, apologized the way most powerful men apologized, which was to say rarely and with the implicit caveat that the apology was primarily administrative, a box checked on the way to the next thing. This didn't sound like that. She wasn't sure what it sounded like. There are things we need to work out, she said, practically. His medical situation means decisions come fast sometimes. I need you to understand that. Tell me what you need. She organized her thoughts. I need you to know that I am Ethan's primary parent, and that doesn't change. I need you to understand that his medical team answers to me, and that if you want a relationship with him, with the decisions around his care, it goes through me. I need you to not show up at 3 a.m. expecting things. That wasn't... He seemed to reconsider. That was an accident. I wasn't planning it. I know. I'm not saying it was strategic. I'm saying that's not how this works going forward. Okay? And I need you to understand that Ethan doesn't know you. He's 4 months old, so the knowing is limited. But the point stands. You can't just arrive and be his father. It doesn't work that way. I understand that. Do you? She wasn't being cruel exactly, but she needed him to actually hear it. Because I know you, Ryan. I know how you operate when you've decided on something. You optimize, you make a plan, and you execute it. You bring in resources, and you move quickly, and you solve the problem. She held his gaze. Ethan is not a problem to solve. He's a sick baby who needs consistency and calm, and people around him who are not processing their own feelings at his bedside. That means I need you to go slowly. Can you do that? A long pause. I can try, he said. It was, Emma thought, possibly the most honest answer he'd given her in years of knowing him. Not of course or absolutely. Those would have been performance. I can try with something real. All right, she said. Ryan's investigation, because that's what it became, though he didn't frame it that way even to himself, was not something he planned. It happened organically, the way certain things happen when you have resources and a nature that defaults to information gathering when you feel unsteady. He requested Ethan's medical records through proper channels. As a next of kin, once Emma had signed the consent form that made that possible, she'd signed it the next day, without drama, because she was practical even when she was guarded. He hired a private physician, Dr. Samuel Park, as a consultant to review the records and give Ryan an independent assessment, not because he distrusted Patricia Nguyen, but because he needed to understand the situation through his own process, and his own process involved multiple data points. Dr. Park's assessment aligned with Dr. Nguyen's. Ethan's condition was serious and progressing. Medical management was appropriate for now. The transplant conversation was real, and the timeline was uncertain, which was the worst kind of uncertain, because it meant the crisis could be weeks away, or months away, or tomorrow. He also found himself in those first days doing something more uncomfortable than reviewing medical records. He was reconstructing the timeline, not clinically, personally, going back over the years of his marriage and the year that preceded its end, and trying to see it from a vantage point that was not his own. He was not naturally inclined to self-examination. He knew this. He'd known it during the marriage too, in the abstract, the way you know things about yourself that you haven't quite allowed to become actionable. He was good at analysis when it concerned systems external to himself, markets, companies, risk profiles, organizational structures. He was considerably less good at it when the system in question was the life he'd been living and the effect he'd had on the people in it. What he found, when he made himself look, was not flattering. He found the dinner table. Not just the Singapore night, but dozens of dinner tables preceding it. Conversations he'd been physically present for, but mentally absent from. Emma saying things that he'd filed as background information, as ambient noise, as the personal life channel that he checked in on occasionally and muted when it required too much bandwidth. He found the canceled trips, the postponed conversations, the way he'd understood their childlessness, not as a decision they'd made together, but as a default that suited him and that he'd therefore assumed suited them both. He found the specific, identifiable night she'd said, "I need to talk to you," and he'd checked his watch. He sat with this information the way he sat with bad earnings reports. He didn't excuse it or explain it away. He let it be what it was. It was bad. His assistant, Kira, noticed that something was different. She'd worked with him for 4 years, and she knew his patterns, the way support staff know the patterns of the people they work for, through proximity and accumulated data and the specific kind of attention that comes from needing to anticipate. She didn't ask what was going on. She restructured his calendar without being asked, moving things around so that 2-hour blocks appeared each afternoon without any label. And when he asked her about it, she said, "I figured you might need some time. I don't need to know why." He went to the hospital those afternoons. He sat in the corridor at first. He didn't want to crowd Emma, and he wasn't sure what his presence in the room was or wasn't, and there was something in him that felt it was right to approach this gradually. He sat in the corridor, and occasionally he saw the door open and caught a glimpse of Ethan in his crib. And once he saw Emma feeding him, a bottle, very carefully, her whole attention on it, and the image lodged somewhere in his chest in a place he couldn't quite locate. On the 4th afternoon, Emma came into the corridor and said, "You can come in, if you want." He wanted. He sat in the chair against the wall, the one that had become, apparently, his chair. Ethan was awake, which Ryan had not yet experienced. He'd seen him sleeping in the low light of early morning, a small static form. Awake was different. Awake, Ethan had opinions. His arms moved with the imprecise determination of someone who has recently discovered that arms are a thing that exist and is not sure yet what to do with them. His face cycled through expressions that seemed to have no reference point in adult experience. A sudden frown, a contemplative blankness, something that was adjacent to a smile but might also have been gas, Emma said when Ryan looked at her. "Does he look like me?" Ryan asked. He hadn't meant to say that out loud. Emma glanced at him. "The hair," she said. "And around the eyes, a little. My mother thinks it's the eyebrows." Ryan looked at Ethan's eyebrows. Small, dark, arranged at a faintly skeptical angle. "My mother called them Blackwell eyebrows," Emma said. Her voice was neutral. "When she first saw him." Ryan looked at Emma. "Your mother knows." "My mother has known since before he was born." Emma didn't flinch from his gaze. "She wanted me to tell you, for the record." "Smart woman," Ryan said. "She is." A pause. "She'll want to meet you, eventually. She has things she'll want to say to you." "I imagine she does." Emma looked at him. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not softening, exactly, but a degree of sharpness going out of it. "For what it's worth," she said, "she's fair. She'll be honest. She won't be cruel about it." "I don't need her to be gentle about it," Ryan said. "I'd rather she be accurate." Ethan made a sound, not distress, more like commentary. Both of them looked at him, and he looked back with those gray-green eyes, frowning slightly at nothing in particular. "He does that," Emma said. "Makes sounds when we're not paying attention to him." "Competitive," Ryan said, without thinking about it. Emma's mouth did something that was not quite a smile. "Yes," she said. "He is, Mag." Dana found Emma in the hospital cafeteria on the 6th day, staring at a cup of soup she hadn't touched. "You need to eat that," Dana said. "I know." Dana sat down across from her and pulled the soup to a better angle and waited. "He came again today," Emma said. "Ryan?" "He brought a book." She said it with an expression Dana couldn't categorize. "A book about infant cardiac conditions. One of the medical texts. He'd had someone flag the sections relevant to Ethan's specific diagnosis. Dana was quiet for a moment. That's either very thoughtful or very Ryan Blackwell. Both, Emma said. It's both. She looked at her soup. He asked Dr. Nguyen questions today. Good questions. She told me afterward that he'd clearly done his reading. And how do you feel about that? Emma picked up a spoon, put it down. I don't know. I keep waiting for the version of him I know. The one that schedules things and delegates the inconvenient parts and moves on when something requires more than he's willing to give. She looked at Dana. This version is being very present. People can change, Dana said carefully. People can also perform for a while and then stop. Also true. Dana reached over and pushed the soup back toward her. Eat. You can decide how to feel about Ryan Blackwell after you've had a hot meal. Emma ate the soup. It was not good soup. She ate it anyway because Dana was right, and because she was running low on everything and couldn't afford to run lower. That night, after Ryan had left and Dana had gone home, and the hospital had settled into its 3 a.m. rhythm, Emma sat beside Ethan's crib and thought about the dinner table. Not from her side this time. From his. She tried to reconstruct what Ryan had looked like across from her on those evenings. Not the specific things he'd said or failed to say, but what he'd looked like, what the posture and the distance and the phone in hand had meant to him versus what it had meant to her. She'd read it as indifference for so long, and maybe it had been indifference, or maybe it had been something else. Fear, possibly, or just the profound absence of self-awareness that looks like indifference from the outside. She didn't know. She wasn't sure she could know. What she knew was Ethan, the weight of him, the sound of his breathing in the dark, the way his monitor numbers looked when he was having a good hour versus a harder one. She knew the exact readings that made her relax by degrees and the exact readings that made her hand move toward the call button. She knew that his heart was working too hard for what it was getting done. She knew that there was a conversation coming with Dr. Nguyen, with the transplant team, with whatever fate-adjacent process decided whose name moved up on which list, that she was going to have without being fully ready to have it. She knew that Ryan Blackwell had sat in the chair against the wall for 4 out of the last 6 days, and that his questions to the medical team were good ones, and that he'd looked at Ethan's eyebrows with an expression she still didn't have a name for, but that she found, increasingly, she did not want to be the only one carrying. Ethan shifted in his crib. His eyes opened briefly. Those undecided gray-green eyes found her face and closed again. I know, Emma said quietly, to no one. I know. Outside, the city moved through the night without waiting for anyone to be ready. It never did. The meeting with Dr. Patricia Nguyen happened on a Wednesday morning, 12 days after Ryan had first walked past room 14 and stopped. Emma had requested it. That was important to her. That she'd been the one to call it, that it had happened on her timeline, not because a crisis had forced it. She'd looked at Ethan's numbers over the preceding 3 days, and she'd looked at them with a nurse's eyes, not a mother's eyes, and what she'd seen had made her pick up the phone. She'd also, after a night of internal negotiation she wasn't proud of, texted Ryan and told him to come. He'd arrived 7 minutes early. She'd noticed. Dr. Nguyen's office was small and functionally organized, the office of someone who spent as little time as possible in it. She had photographs on her desk, family, a dog, a vacation somewhere with mountains, that she'd turned slightly toward the wall, Emma had noticed before, the way medical professionals sometimes did in difficult conversations, creating a small privacy for their personal life when they were delivering news that belonged entirely to the clinical. Emma knew the gesture. She'd made it herself. I want to talk about where we are, Doctor, Nguyen said, and I want to be direct with both of you because I think that's more useful than managing the information in pieces. Please, Emma said. Ryan said nothing. He was sitting very straight in his chair, the way Emma had learned he sat when he was working hard to control his reaction to something. Ethan's heart function has declined over the past 10 days, Dr. Nguyen said. We've adjusted his medications twice, and we've gotten some stabilization, but the underlying trajectory is not moving in the direction we want. She paused, and in the pause, Emma felt the weight of what was coming, the way you feel weather before it arrives. We need to begin the formal transplant evaluation process, now, not as a contingency, as the active plan. The room was quiet. What does that mean in terms of timeline? Ryan asked. His voice was steady. Emma didn't know whether to be relieved or unsettled by how steady it was. The evaluation itself takes 1 to 2 weeks. Once he's listed, we're dependent on donor availability. Median wait time for a pediatric cardiac transplant at his age and blood type is... Dr. Nguyen looked at both of them with the specific care of someone choosing how to deliver a hard number. Somewhere between 3 weeks and 4 months, depending on a lot of factors we can't control. And his current condition? Emma asked. Can he sustain a wait of 4 months? A pause that lasted about 1 second too long. We're going to do everything we can to support him through the wait. There are interventions available if his function drops further, but I won't tell you this is without risk, because it is. Every week matters. Emma nodded. She had her hands flat on her knees, pressing down slightly. She was aware of this and couldn't stop it. What do you need from us to start the evaluation today? Ryan said. Dr. Nguyen looked at him, and Emma saw the doctor make a small recalibration. She'd met Ryan only in passing before this, had formed her initial read, and something in his question was adjusting it. I have the paperwork for both of you. Emma, most of it is material you've already been through in preliminary form. Ryan, as the biological father, there are genetic components to the evaluation that will require your participation. Blood work, medical history. Whatever you need, he said. Today. Dr. Nguyen looked at Emma. Emma gave a small nod that meant yes, this is real. This is who he is right now. I'm still processing it too. They did the blood work that afternoon, Ryan in the lab down the corridor, while Emma sat with Ethan. He came back with a small adhesive bandage on the inside of his elbow and sat in his chair without saying anything for a while. And when Emma glanced at him, he was watching Ethan with that look she still hadn't named. He's on the evaluation list starting tomorrow, Emma said. I heard. Ryan. She waited until he looked at her. This is going to be hard. The waiting part. I need you to understand that there's no deal to close here. There's no action item that makes it move faster. You're going to have to sit with not being able to do anything. He held her gaze. I know. Do you, though? Because I've watched you for 2 weeks, and I know you've already called Dr. Park and had the records independently reviewed and restructured your schedule and read every piece of literature you could find on Ethan's condition. And all of that is... I'm not saying it's wrong. It's not wrong. It's just... It's how I manage fear, he said quietly. She stopped. He looked at Ethan. It's how I've always managed it. I make it into a project, I acquire information, and I make a plan, and I move. I know it's not the only way to be in a situation. I know it doesn't always fit. He paused. I'm trying to learn when to stop moving. Emma looked at him for a moment. That's a surprisingly self-aware thing to say. Don't sound so shocked, he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost dry, almost the version of him she'd once found compelling across a fundraiser room on a rainy November evening. I've had some time to think. The evaluation process was grueling in the specific way that medical waiting is grueling, which is to say that it involved both interminable stretches of nothing and sudden compressed bursts of urgency, and the interminable stretches were in some ways harder. Emma had been through waiting before, in clinical settings with other people's families, and she had thought she understood what it felt like from the inside. She had been wrong. The days found a structure of sorts. Mornings were the medical part. Rounds, Dr. Nguyen's updates, the readings and adjustments that constituted Ethan's daily management. Emma was there for all of it, taking notes she didn't need to take, because the act of writing steadied her. Early afternoons were quieter, and Ethan sometimes slept long enough that Emma could eat something real, which Dana continued to appear for with the reliability of tidal movement. Ryan came in the afternoons on most days, and on the days he came, he stayed until evening. He had, somewhere in the second week, learned to give a bottle. This had not been planned. Emma had been in a conversation with one of the cardiac nurses in the corridor, and Ryan had been in the room, and Ethan had decided that his opinion about being hungry needed to be registered immediately and at volume. Emma had come back into the room to find Ryan holding Ethan at an angle that was technically incorrect, the bottle positioned wrong, Ethan's face red and working toward outrage, and Ryan's expression one of concentrated alarm. He's held slightly more upright, Emma said, stepping in, and the bottle should be at... She adjusted his arm, tilted the bottle. There. Ethan accepted the correction and latched on. The room went quiet. Ryan looked at Emma. Is that right? Better, she said. He looked back at Ethan. His arms had gone very careful, very deliberate, the way they'd have gone deliberate if someone had handed him something irreplaceable, which was, Emma thought, accurate. He's heavier than he looks, Ryan said. He weighs 11 pounds. That's not heavy. In a meaningful way it is. Ryan looked at her with an expression that was trying to be something other than what it was, which was a man in over his head in a way he found he did not entirely mind. I don't know how to do this, he said. No one does, Emma said. You figure it out. She sat back down in her chair and watched her son eat, and didn't look at Ryan's face, because looking at his face right now required a kind of emotional composure she was not sure she had. Emma's mother, Carol Hayes, arrived from Phoenix on the 15th day. She was 62 years old, with Emma's coloring and Dana's quality of directness, and she came through the door of Ethan's room with 2 bags and the air of a woman who had organized her feelings on the flight and was ready to be useful. She held Ethan for a long time without saying anything. Then she looked up and saw Ryan, who had been in his chair in the corner, and the room did something complicated. Ryan stood. Mrs. Hayes. Carol looked at him with an expression that Emma recognized as her mother's assessment face. Not hostile, precisely, but thorough. Ryan? A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. You look tired. I've been here a lot, he said. Yes, Emma told me. She looked at him a moment longer, then turned her attention back to Ethan. He has your eyebrows, she said, without looking up. I told Emma that months ago. She didn't want to discuss it. Mom, Emma said, I'm just noting a fact. Carol adjusted Ethan against her chest with the easy certainty of a woman who had carried babies and known exactly how to do it. Sit down, Ryan. You don't have to stand on ceremony in a hospital room. He sat. Carol stayed for a week. She and Ryan reached a kind of functional détente that Emma watched with the wary attention of someone who has placed 2 chemicals in proximity and is monitoring for reaction. Her mother was not warm to him, exactly. She was fair, as Emma had predicted, but the fairness had a particular texture to it, the fairness of a woman who had watched her daughter sit alone in a hospital room for 4 days and had formed opinions about the circumstances leading to that solitude. She asked Ryan questions, direct ones, about his work and his schedule and his understanding of what Ethan's care was going to require long term, and she listened to his answers with the same focused quality that Emma had. One evening, Emma came back from a conversation with Dr. Nguyen to find her mother and Ryan sitting in the 2 chairs beside Ethan's crib, both of them watching him sleep, not talking. She stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them noticed her. Something about the image, the 2 of them in the low light, her son between them, the evening quiet, sat in her chest in a way she couldn't categorize. He settled about 20 minutes ago, Carol said when she heard Emma come in. He was fussing, and Ryan sang to him. Emma looked at Ryan. You sang to him. Ryan looked at the wall. It worked. What did you sing? A pause. The first verse of something I half remembered from when I was a kid. It probably wasn't accurate. Did it have a tune? Loosely. Carol made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Emma thought it might have been the first time her mother had made that sound in Ryan's presence, and she filed it away as information without knowing exactly what to do with it. The crisis, when it came on a Friday. Ethan had been doing better that week, or what counted as better, which was that his numbers had been stable and he'd been awake and engaged more consistently and had deployed the Blackwell eyebrows in ways that made both Emma and Ryan, on separate occasions, lose the thread of whatever they'd been saying. Doctor. Ween had used the word encouraging, which was a word she deployed with surgical restraint, and Emma had allowed herself to carry it for about 48 hours. Friday morning at 11:40, Ethan's oxygen saturation dropped. Not gradually. It went from the acceptable range to the alarming range in the space of about 4 minutes, and the monitor's alarm did the thing it was designed to do, and Priya was through the door before Emma had fully processed the numbers, and then there were 3 nurses and doctor. Muin and a respiratory technician, and Emma was asked, gently but with authority, to step back, and she did. because she was a nurse and she knew what step back meant in this context. But being a nurse did not make it possible to feel what it felt like to step back from her own child. She stood against the far wall. She watched the team work. She read the numbers on the monitor with clinical eyes that were also a mother's eyes, and the combination was unbearable in a way she didn't have language for. Someone had called Ryan. She didn't know who, maybe the front desk, where he'd established a contact protocol weeks ago without telling her about it, which she'd found out about later and hadn't decided how to feel about. He came through the door 22 minutes after the alarm, still in his coat, and he saw Emma against the wall and crossed to her immediately. He didn't say anything. He stood beside her and looked at the team working around Ethan, and his jaw was very tight. "His satties dropped," Emma said. Her voice was flat, clinical. It was the only voice she had right now. "They're managing it. Dr. Nguyen is here." "I see her." He looked at the monitor. "What are the numbers?" She told him. She watched him register them. "Is this—" He stopped and started again, and she could hear him working to keep his voice level and not fully managing it. "Is this what I think it is?" "It means his heart function is declining faster than projected." She kept her eyes on the monitor. "It means the transplant timeline just changed." He didn't say anything to that. He stood beside her, and after a moment she was aware that he'd moved slightly closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and she didn't move away. It took 31 minutes for Ethan's saturation to stabilize. 31 minutes that Emma counted in some unit smaller than minutes, some unit that only existed in hospital rooms when the person on the monitor was yours. When the numbers settled into a range that was still not good, but was no longer the alarm range, she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Dr. Nguyen came to them when the team had finished the immediate intervention. She looked at both of them, Emma and Ryan, and Emma thought about the photographs turned slightly toward the wall. "He's stable," Dr. Nguyen said, "for right now, but what we saw today tells us his cardiac reserve is lower than we'd hoped. He doesn't have the cushion we thought he had." She was direct, because Emma had asked her at the beginning of all this to always be direct. "We need to escalate his status on the transplant list. I'm doing that today. I'm also beginning the process of exploring bridge options, mechanical support if his function continues to decline before a heart becomes available." Emma absorbed this. A VAD, on ventricular assist device. She knew what it meant clinically. For a 4-month-old. "It's not the first choice. It's the contingency that I want to have ready." Dr. Nguyen's voice was very steady. "I want you to know that we are in front of this, Emma. We are not behind it. Today was serious, but it was not a surprise to me, and I have a plan." Emma nodded. Ryan said, "What do you need from us?" Dr. Nguyen looked at him. "I need Emma to rest when she can, because she's going to need to be clear-headed for conversations coming in the next few days that are going to require her full capacity." She said it to Ryan in a way that was clearly directed at him specifically. "This is something you can do. This is something that falls within your scope. And I need both of you to be prepared for the fact that things may move quickly from here in either direction." After she left, they stood outside Ethan's room while the nurses completed the post-incident documentation inside. The corridor had its midday quality, different from the 3 a.m. silence, more active, more inhabited, nurses and orderlies and visitors moving in both directions. Ryan had his hands in his coat pockets. He was looking at the floor. "I canceled Singapore," he said. Emma looked at him. "What?" "The deal I've been managing. I've been managing it remotely, but there was a site meeting next week that I was planning to fly in for." He looked up. "I canceled it, moved the board call, and pulled my team in to handle the site work." A pause. "I'm not going anywhere." She studied him. "That's a significant deal." "Yes." "Will it cost you?" "Probably." He said it without the slightest indication that this was a difficult calculation. "It'll cost me less than not being here." Emma looked at him for a long moment. She was tired enough that her defenses were operating on low power, and through the gap she felt something that she'd been keeping at a careful distance for weeks. Not trust. Trust was not something that came back in pieces, she knew that. It came back or it didn't. But something that preceded trust. Something that was almost its precondition. "Ryan," she said, "you need to be prepared for what Ethan is going to need from you emotionally. Not just logistically, not just resources. She looked at him carefully. If something goes wrong, not if, when, because things will go wrong, this is a long road. He's going to need a father who can sit in the middle of hard things without needing to fix them. Can you be that person? He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of a man who was being asked a real question and was taking it seriously. I don't know, he said. I've never been that person for anyone. He stopped. I've been good at solving things. I've been less good at being in them. He met her eyes. I want to learn. I understand that wanting to isn't the same as knowing how. Something in Emma's chest shifted that she hadn't expected to shift. Okay, she said. That's enough? It's honest. Honest is enough to start with. The days that followed were the hardest Emma had experienced since the night Ethan had gone gray in her arms. Not because the numbers got dramatically worse. They didn't. Ethan held in that narrow band of serious but stable that had become their new normal. But because of the particular mental and emotional weight of waiting for something you cannot predict or control. She took Dr. Nguyen's instruction to rest with more seriousness than she'd taken it before the Friday crisis. Not because she wanted to sleep. She didn't, or she did, but her body and her mind couldn't seem to coordinate it. But because she understood what the doctor had been telling her, which was that a crisis was coming and she needed to be present for it, and being present required not being completely depleted. Ryan took this mandate with a seriousness that surprised her. He arranged, without being asked, for a rotation of coverage at the hospital. Himself, Carol on the days she was there, Dana when she wasn't on shift, so that Emma had windows of time she could leave the building. He didn't frame it as a favor. He framed it as a schedule, the way he framed everything. And Emma had looked at the schedule and recognized that it was an act of care dressed in the only language he'd ever been fluent in. She used one of those windows to walk. Just walk. Around the neighborhood adjacent to the hospital, past the coffee shop where she and Dana had a standing Saturday habit that had been on hold for weeks, past the park with the fountain that wasn't running in November, through streets that were continuing their business with the indifference of streets. She walked for 40 minutes, and she did not think about Ethan's numbers or transplant timelines, or the specific weight of Ryan Blackwell standing in a hospital corridor saying, "I'm not going anywhere." She thought about nothing she could name afterward. She just moved through the cold air. When she came back, Ryan was in Ethan's room alone. Ethan was awake, in a bouncy seat that Carol had brought and that Ryan had apparently figured out how to position, because it was at the correct angle. Ryan was talking to him, not in the slightly self-conscious way that adults sometimes talk to babies when they thought someone might be watching, but directly, unself-consciously, like a person who had decided that the conversation was real, regardless of whether one participant could fully participate. She stood in the doorway and didn't announce herself. "I know you don't know what any of this means yet," Ryan was saying, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees, looking at Ethan. "That's probably fine. You've got enough going on, but I want you to know that I'm—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not going to be the kind of person who shows up when it's convenient. I know that might not mean much yet, but I'm working on making it true." Ethan looked at him with the gray-green eyes. "The eyebrows are from my side," Ryan said. "I want that acknowledged." Ethan moved one arm with the vague authority of someone who may or may not be agreeing. Emma stepped back from the doorway and stood in the corridor for a moment, pressing the back of one hand against her mouth, not because she was crying, she wasn't quite, but because she needed a second that belonged only to her before she went back into that room. She allowed herself the second. Then she went in. The call came on a Thursday, 26 days after Ethan had been placed on the active transplant list. Emma's phone rang at 6:18 in the morning. She was already awake. She was always already awake at 6:18, sitting in the chair beside Ethan's crib in the way that had become so habitual that she sometimes felt she'd been sitting in it her whole life, that there was no before the chair. Ethan had had a harder night. His overnight numbers had done the uneven thing that meant no one had fully rested, including the nursing staff, and the morning had that particular texture of nights that don't quite end. She looked at the number on the phone. It was Dr. Nguyen's direct line. "Dr. Nguyen," Emma answered. "Emma." A pause. "We have a potential match." Emma's hand went flat against Ethan's crib rail. She gripped it. "I need you to listen carefully, doctor." Nguyen continued, and her voice had the quality that Emma recognized from the other side of clinical training, the voice you used when you needed someone to hear every word with absolute accuracy. "There is a donor heart that is a strong preliminary match for Ethan. We are in the process of confirming compatibility now. If the confirmation comes back as we expect, we would be moving to surgery." A pause. "Today. This afternoon." "This afternoon," Emma repeated. "The transplant team is being assembled. I need you to authorize beginning the prep protocol for Ethan now, so we're not losing time if the confirmation comes through. And Emma," Dr. Nguyen's voice shifted by a fraction, just enough. "I need you to call anyone who should be here." Emma had already dialed Ryan before Dr. Nguyen finished the sentence. He picked up on the second ring. "Emma." "Come now," she said. "Come right now." He was there in 19 minutes. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. She'd learned them, she realized, in the weeks of his comings and goings, had learned the specific rhythm and pace of them. And then he was in the doorway, and he looked at her and at Ethan and at the nurses who were beginning the prep protocol, and his face went through several things quickly and then settled into something controlled and present. "They found a heart," Emma said. He crossed the room and stood beside her and looked at Ethan, who was looking back at both of them with those gray-green eyes, unaware that today was different from other days, unaware that the world had arranged itself into a before and after that he was too young to understand. "Okay," Ryan said. His voice was very quiet. "The confirmation is still coming. It's not certain yet." "I know." He looked at Ethan. "Whatever happens, I'm here." Emma looked at her son. She had been counting his breath since October, since a Tuesday afternoon and a phone call to paramedics, since a bathtub and 2 lines on a test, since a dinner table and a question she hadn't asked. She counted them now in the early morning light of the room that had become the whole world, while the hospital assembled itself around them for what was coming. She counted. The phone rang. Dr. Nguyen's voice said, "Emma, it's confirmed." They took Ethan at 12 minutes past 9 in the morning. Emma had been told what to expect. She'd been told by Dr. Nguyen, by the surgical coordinator, by the transplant nurse named Robert, who had the specific manner of someone who had walked many families through this exact corridor and understood that the walking was as important as the talking. She'd been told that the handoff would be quick, that quick was better, that prolonged goodbyes before a surgery were harder on the parents than on the patient, especially a patient who was 4 months old and could not yet distinguish between a Tuesday and the most consequential morning of his life. Knowing all of this did not make it easier to watch them wheel his crib through the double doors. She had held him for the 10 minutes before they came, not performing anything, not saying anything particularly meaningful. She'd said "I love you" once, quietly, into the top of his head where the dark hair curled, and then she'd just held him the way she'd been holding him for months, with her whole body oriented toward his, measuring his warmth, the weight of him, the specific rhythm of his breathing that she knew better than she knew her own. She had memorized him the way you memorize things you are afraid of losing, completely and without peace. Ryan had stood to her left. He hadn't tried to hold Ethan. That time had not yet come. There had not been enough time for that to be natural, but he'd stood close, and once, briefly, he'd put his hand on the top of Ethan's head, very gently, and left it there for a moment. When the transport team came and Robert said it's time, Emma had passed Ethan over with hands that were entirely steady. She was a nurse. She knew how to hand a patient to a team. She was also a mother, and the two things existed simultaneously in her body without resolving, and she stood in the corridor and watched the double doors swing shut behind her son, and felt both of those things at the same moment. Ryan's hand found her arm. Not her hand, her arm, just above the elbow. The kind of contact that was support without being a claim. She didn't pull away. "Come sit down," he said. She sat down. Papa. The waiting room outside the cardiac surgical suite was a different room from the family consultation room, from Ethan's room, from any of the other rooms Emma had learned over the past weeks. It had the generic aspiration of all hospital waiting rooms, chairs that were trying, a television mounted in the corner currently showing a morning news program with the sound off, a table with magazines that were 4 months old, a window that looked out on the side of another building. It smelled like the rest of the hospital. It had a clock on the wall, large and institutional, with a second hand that moved in discrete ticks rather than a sweep. Emma watched the second hand for approximately 40 seconds before she stopped watching it. Carol arrived at 9:50, having taken the first available flight from Phoenix when Emma had called her the previous afternoon. She came through the waiting room door with her coat still on and her bag over her shoulder, and she looked at Emma, and then she sat down next to her without taking off her coat and put her arm around her daughter and didn't say anything at all. This was, Emma thought, the right call. There was nothing to say. They were in the category of situation that made language feel presumptuous. Dana arrived at 10:20, still in her scrubs from the tail end of a shift she'd apparently finished early. She brought coffee and a box of crackers that no one ate and sat on Emma's other side and also, with the wisdom of someone who understood Emma, did not say much. Ryan sat across from them, in a chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped. He'd taken off his coat an hour ago. His phone was face down on the chair beside him, which Emma noticed because in 4 years of marriage, she had never seen Ryan voluntarily put his phone face down, as if removing the gravitational pull of it by choice. The room held its breath. At some point around 11, Ryan got up and came back with coffee for Emma's mother, who accepted it with an expression that was not warm but was something a degree or two adjacent to warm. They exchanged no words. Ryan sat back down. At 11:40, Carol said, without preamble, addressing Ryan across the room, "I owe you some honesty." Ryan looked up. "Okay. I told Emma she should contact you. When Ethan was first diagnosed, before he was born," Carol's voice was even, "she disagreed with me, and I let her make her own decision because she's an adult and it was her situation to manage. But I want you to know that I believed, for a long time, that keeping this from you was the wrong call. Not just for Ethan, for Emma too." She paused. She was carrying something that was too heavy to carry alone, and some of that weight was yours to carry, and you weren't there to take it. Ryan held her gaze. "I know. You weren't there because of choices you made in your marriage. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "No," Ryan said. "I know that too." Carol looked at him for a long moment with the particular thorough attention that Emma had also. "You've been here every day." "Yes." "Every day since you found out?" "Yes." Another pause. "That matters," Carol said. "I want you to know I see it. It doesn't erase the rest of it, but it matters." She looked back at her hands. "I wanted to say that while there was time." The room went back to its silence. Emma looked at her mother and felt something complicated that she did not try to name. The surgery lasted 6 hours and 14 minutes. Emma knew this because she had started counting at 9:12, when the doors had closed, and she had not fully stopped counting anything since. 6 hours and 14 minutes, measured in coffee cups and trips to the bathroom, and the particular progression of morning to afternoon that the waiting room window recorded in changing light against the side of the neighboring building. At 12:30, Ryan's phone, face up now, because he'd turned it over when a number he'd been expecting had called, buzzed twice, and he looked at it and silenced it. He looked up and found Emma watching him. "Singapore, Tom," he said. "I'll deal with it later." "It was your biggest deal this quarter," Emma said. She didn't know why she said it. She'd been tracking it peripherally, the way you track information about a person whose life you know the shape of. "Yes," he said. "And you're just—" "Yes," he said again, with a finality that wasn't aggressive, just settled. "I am." At 2:15, Dana fell asleep in her chair, her head dropping to the side with the abrupt surrender of someone who has been running on a shift's worth of adrenaline and hit the wall. Emma pulled a thin hospital blanket from somewhere. She knew the waiting room supplies. She'd been on the other side of this room too, and draped it over her friend's shoulders. Dana didn't stir. At 2:50, Ryan moved from his chair to the one beside Emma's. He didn't explain the move or call attention to it. He sat beside her and looked at the same wall she was looking at, and she did not tell him to move back. At 3:07, Emma said, to the wall, "I keep thinking about the first time I heard his heartbeat. Ultrasound, 12 weeks. I was alone. I told myself I was fine going alone. I'd done plenty of ultrasounds alone when I was working. I knew exactly what I was looking at." She paused. "And I heard it, and I completely fell apart. Just sat there in the dark crying, and the technician was very kind and very confused about why I was upset, and I couldn't explain that I wasn't upset. I was just—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the fact of it. that there was a heart, that it was his. Ryan was quiet for a moment. I would have been there, he said. If I'd known. She looked at the wall. I know. I want you to know that. Not as an argument, just as a fact. His voice was low, without pressure behind it. Whatever choices I made that led to you not telling me, I would have been there for that. I know, she said again. And she did know. That was the complicated part. It wasn't that Ryan had been a man who wouldn't show up for important moments. He showed up for things he understood were important. He just had an impaired ability to recognize what was important, and the impairment had looked, from the inside of their marriage, indistinguishable from not caring. She turned to look at him. Ryan. He turned. When this is over, when Ethan is through this and we're on the other side of the recovery, we're going to have to build something that neither of us has a template for. You as his father, and me and you as whatever we are to each other in that context. She held his gaze. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not going to pretend I know. Neither do I, he said. But I want you to understand that whatever we build, it gets built slowly. Not because I'm punishing you, because the only way things actually hold is if you build them slowly. He nodded. I understand that. Do you understand that I mean it? That I'll hold you to it? That the second you start making this into a project you optimize and execute, I'll lose the thread, he said. Yes, I know. He looked at her with an expression she'd been slowly developing a vocabulary for over the past weeks. Not the face she'd known in their marriage, which had been capable and directed and largely opaque, but something that had been stripped of the opacity. I'm not going to tell you I've solved the problems I had. I'd be lying and you'd know I was lying and we'd both be worse off. He paused. What I can tell you is that I know what the problems are now, which I didn't before. Or I did know somewhere, and I didn't let myself get to that somewhere very often. Another pause. I'm getting there more often. Emma looked at him for a long moment. She thought about him turning his phone face down. She thought about the first verse of a half-remembered song, loosely tuned. She thought about I can try, offered honestly, without the gloss of confidence he usually applied to everything. She looked back at the wall. Okay, she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the absence of damage. It was a door left open, which was what she had. Dr. Nguyen came through the door at 3:26. Emma was on her feet before she'd made a conscious decision to stand. Beside her, Ryan had risen too. Dana startled awake and oriented herself with the speed of someone whose body knew what a doctor appearing in a doorway meant. Carol straightened in her chair. Dr. Nguyen's face. Emma had spent 9 years reading clinical faces, her own face in mirrors before difficult conversations, the faces of colleagues managing information, the specific configurations that corresponded to different categories of news. She read Dr. Nguyen's face in the space of 1 second. He's out of surgery, Dr. Nguyen said. The transplant was successful. Emma heard Carol make a sound behind her. She heard Dana say something she didn't catch. She was looking at Dr. Nguyen's face and processing successful against the specific quality of the doctor's expression, which was tired and careful, and underneath both, something that was relief. He's being moved to the ICU now, Dr. Nguyen continued. The next 24 to 72 hours are critical. We're watching for rejection, for infection, for cardiac function in the new heart. He's not clear yet. I want to be honest about that. But the surgery went as well as we could have hoped, and the new heart is beating. The new heart is beating. Emma sat back down. Not because she chose to, but because her legs made the choice for her, quietly and without drama, just taking her down into the chair. Ryan sat beside her. She was aware of his hand finding hers on the armrest. Finding it, not grasping it, just resting there beside hers until she turned her hand over and he held it properly. She let him. When can we see him? Ryan asked. His voice was rough in a way she'd never heard from him before. An hour, Dr. Nguyen said. Maybe 90 minutes. Robert will come for you. She looked at them both, Ryan and Emma, and she looked at their joined hands, and her expression did something small and human. Go eat something, both of you. You're going to need to be present for the next phase, and you're running on empty. She looked at Carol and Dana. That goes for everyone in this room. She left. The room existed in the particular silence that follows enormous news that hasn't fully arrived yet, that you're still in the process of receiving. Dana was crying. Emma registered this distantly. Dana, who almost never cried, whose clinical composure was legendary among their colleagues, was sitting in the chair with the hospital blanket across her lap and tears running down her face with the absolute matter-of-factness of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has just been permitted to put it down. Carol had her hands pressed flat together, not in prayer. Emma's mother was not a woman who prayed, but in the gesture of someone who has been gripping something tightly and is now releasing her grip slowly, finger by finger. Ryan was looking at the ceiling. His throat moved. His hand was warm around Emma's. He made it, Emma said. To no one. To the room. No one answered, because the answer was yes, and yes didn't need saying. The ICU was quieter than the surgical waiting room in a different way. The surgical waiting room had been the quiet of suspension, of everything held in place against the possibility of bad news. The ICU quiet was active, the quiet of machines doing their work, of a body being carefully monitored as it began the process of accepting something new and foreign and necessary. Ethan was very small in the ICU bed, smaller than he'd seemed in the cardiac unit, or maybe that was the contrast with all the equipment. The ventilator breathing for him while his body recovered from the anesthesia, the monitoring leads in their new configuration, the IV lines, the drainage tubes, the careful arrangement of everything that was keeping him stable in this transitional place between the surgery and whatever came next. Emma stood at the bedside and looked at him for a long time without touching him. She was allowed to touch him. Robert had told her that touch was good, that familiar voices were good. But for the first moment, she just looked, taking inventory, reading his face, his color, the rise and fall of his chest assisted by the ventilator. His color was better than she'd expected. She registered this with nurse eyes first before mother eyes, and the nurse eyes said, acceptable. This is acceptable. This is what post-transplant looks like in the first hours. This is within normal range. And then the mother eyes said, he's here, he made it through. She put her hand on his arm, very lightly. Hey, Bug, she said quietly. I'm here. Ryan stood on the other side of the bed. He looked at Ethan the way he'd looked at him in the early mornings when he first came to the hospital. That expression she'd spent weeks developing a vocabulary for, and which she'd finally, privately, named as something between awe and reckoning. He didn't try to say anything for a while. He just stood there, his hands gripping the bed rail, and looked at his son. After a while, he said very quietly, his color looks better. It does, Emma agreed. Is that a good sign? Yes. She looked across at him. It's a real good sign. He exhaled slowly. It was the exhale of someone who has been breathing in a specific way for hours and has just allowed themselves to stop. The first 72 hours were the hardest of the recovery, and they were hard in ways that were different from what had come before. The previous hard had been anticipatory, waiting, counting, dreading what might come. This hard was active. Ethan's body was doing the work of accepting a foreign heart, and the work was not linear, and each shift brought its own set of numbers and adjustments and small crises that the ICU team managed with the calm of people who do this regularly and the awareness that regular doesn't mean easy. There was a rejection scare on the second day. Emma was there for it. She was always there, or she was in the waiting room just outside, and she sat in her chair with her phone in her hand while the team made medication adjustments, and Dr. Nguyen spoke in the low, precise voice she used when things needed to move quickly. Ryan had arrived 15 minutes into it, having been called, and had sat beside Emma without speaking for the duration. When it resolved, partially, provisionally, the team was satisfied for now, Ryan said, "What just happened?" His body pushed back a little against the new heart, Emma said. They adjusted his immunosuppressants. It's manageable. Is that going to keep happening? For a while, probably. The first months post-transplant it's a negotiation. His immune system learning to accept something that isn't originally his. She looked at him. It's not a straight line. He absorbed this. Okay? Then, How are you doing? She looked at him. The question was simple, and he'd asked it looking directly at her, not at Ethan or the monitor. Actually, at her, with the attentiveness of someone who had decided to practice paying attention. I'm frightened, she said. And I'm relieved. And I'm frightened again. All at the same time, more or less. She paused. That's where I am. Yeah, he said. Same. It was an honest answer from a man she had once believed incapable of honest answers about anything internal, and she accepted it without comment. The turning point came on the fourth day. Not dramatically, not with any specific announcement, but in the aggregate way that improvement comes in these situations, in accumulated small data points that start trending in the same direction. Ethan's rejection markers improved. His ventilator settings were adjusted down incrementally. His blood pressure found a more consistent range. Dr. Nguyen came in on the fourth morning and looked at the numbers and looked at Ethan and said, with the restraint of someone who has been burned by premature optimism, this is looking better than yesterday. I'm cautiously satisfied. Cautiously, Emma said. I'm a cautious person. But something in the doctor's eyes was not cautious at all. By the end of the first week, Ethan was off the ventilator. By the end of the second, he was moved from the ICU to the step-down unit. By the end of the third, he was in a regular room, not room 14. The room had turned over to another patient, but a room on the same floor with the same east-facing window that let in morning light. Emma noticed the window immediately. She didn't mention it. Recovery, it turned out, was its own education. The weeks in the step-down unit and then the regular room had a different texture from the acute weeks in the cardiac unit. There was still vigilance. There would be vigilance for months, maybe years. The medication adjustments and the monitoring and the regular follow-up that was the permanent condition of life after a transplant. But underneath the vigilance, there was now something that had not been there before. A kind of ordinary dailiness began to reassert itself, cautiously, around the edges of the medical reality. Ethan, freed from the most acute phase of his illness, turned out to have opinions, strong ones, and increasingly the ability to express them. He disliked being put down when he was not ready to be put down. He was interested in faces, particularly in the specific faces he'd been looking at most consistently over the past weeks, and he had a way of tracking a person across the room that suggested he was taking notes. He had inherited, it appeared, the attentiveness of one parent and the eyebrows of the other. Ryan came every day. This had not changed. What had changed was the quality of the coming. It was no longer the slightly effortful, slightly self-conscious presence of a man learning how to be somewhere he hadn't been before. It had become habitual, the way a thing becomes habitual when you do it long enough that your body goes on its own. He knew the nurses by name. He knew which monitors mattered and which fluctuations to call the nursing desk about. He knew that Ethan's preferred bottle temperature was slightly warmer than the standard recommendation and that he would make his displeasure known otherwise. He'd also, sometime in the fourth week, started doing something that Emma watched with a complicated mix of feelings she kept to herself. He started talking to Ethan about things. Not baby talk, not the performed simplicity that adults sometimes adopt with infants. Actual things, matters of mild adult interest, observations about the world. The nurses found this entertaining. Dana, the first time she witnessed it, had looked at Emma with an expression that said several things at once. One afternoon, Emma came back from a conversation with the discharge planning nurse to find Ryan sitting with Ethan propped against his knees, demonstrating with great seriousness the difference between various expressions. Ethan was focused on this with the attentiveness of someone who found it genuinely interesting. "You're teaching him faces," Emma said. "He's interested in faces," Ryan said, not looking up. "I'm giving him material to work with." "Is that your board meeting voice?" It was my 9 o'clock voice, adjusted slightly. Emma sat down. She watched them for a while. "He's going to have you completely figured out within 6 months," she said. "He already does," Ryan said. "He's been studying me since the second week. I can tell." A pause. "He's thorough. Gets it from your side." Emma made a sound that was, she realized only after it left her, a laugh, small and tired and real. Ryan looked up at her. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, just the way light shifts on a surface when a cloud moves. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her at that fundraiser on a rainy November evening, And she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, and the moment ended naturally, as moments do. But she kept it. Carol left for Phoenix on a Sunday, 3.5 weeks after the surgery. She stood in the hospital corridor with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder, and she held Ethan for a long time. And when she handed him back to Emma, she reached up and held Emma's face in both hands, the way she'd done when Emma was small. "You did good," Carol said. "All of this. You did it right." "I made a lot of mistakes," Emma said. "Yes. And you did it right anyway." Carol let go. She looked at Ryan, who was standing a respectful distance away. "Ryan." "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Carol," she said. Not warmly, not quite yet, but the direction was clear. "Call me Carol." He nodded. "Carol." She looked at them both, her daughter and this man who had complicated her daughter's life in ways that were still working themselves out. And she said, "Don't waste time being cautious when caution stops being useful. You'll know when that is." And then she walked to the elevator. Emma stood in the corridor holding Ethan and watching the elevator doors close. "She's a force," Ryan said. "Yes," Emma agreed. "I like her." "She'd tell you that's not the point." "I know." He paused. "I like her anyway." The discharge happened on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks and 2 days after the transplant. Dr. Nguyen signed the papers in the manner of someone completing an important piece of work and released them with a set of instructions that Emma had partly memorized and had printed in triplicate anyway. The follow-up schedule was dense: cardiology appointments, rejection monitoring, medication adjustments, and Emma had a system for it, which she had presented to Ryan in the form of a shared calendar that she'd put together late one night, and which he'd looked at and said, without irony, "This is a good system." And she had not told him that she'd been afraid he'd want to improve it. He hadn't tried to improve it. He'd added himself to the notification settings and said, "Tell me which appointments you want me at." "All of them," she'd said, which had surprised her as she said it. "Okay," he'd said simply. Priya, the attending nurse who'd been with them since the beginning, came to say goodbye. She held Ethan and told him he was her favorite patient, which she said every family heard, but which she said with enough conviction that Emma chose to believe it. She hugged Emma in the way that people hug when the thing they've been through together is too large to fit in any other gesture. Robert walked them to the elevator. This had apparently become a custom. He walked families out on discharge days, said it was his favorite part of the job. He shook Ryan's hand, and he told Emma she knew where to find them. The elevator doors opened. Ryan was holding Ethan in the car seat carrier. He'd spent 20 minutes the night before making sure he understood the correct installation method, which had involved a consultation with a YouTube video and Emma providing running commentary. And Emma had the bag over her shoulder, and they stepped in together and the doors closed. In the elevator, Ethan looked up at the lights with the intense focus of someone encountering ceiling lights for the first time in a long time and finding them significant. "He's going to sleep on the drive," Emma said. "Is that normal?" "Yes, car motion usually does it. He's been in a crib for weeks. The movement will knock him out." "Should I sit in back with him?" She looked at him. "You're not going to be able to prevent him from sleeping." "I know, He looked at Ethan. "I don't want to miss anything." Emma looked at the elevator doors. She thought about how many times she'd stood in this elevator in the past weeks, what she'd been carrying each time. She thought about the in-between hour, the hour that belongs to no day in particular, and about how she'd been living in that hour for months, in the seam between what was and what was coming. They were coming out of the seam now, she could feel it. Not into certainty. Nothing ahead was certain. There was no version of this life that was going to be simple or resolved or without the ongoing work of Ethan's health and the ongoing work of what she and Ryan were building, but into something, into the day that followed the in-between. The elevator opened on the ground floor. They walked out into the hospital lobby and through the main doors and into the November air, which was cold and bright and indifferent to the significance of the morning, the way the world always is, not caring that something enormous has just shifted, just going about its business. Ryan looked at Emma over the car seat carrier. Ethan had not yet fallen asleep. He was looking at the sky with the same focused attention he'd given the elevator lights, as if he was filing it, updating his records. "Ready?" Ryan asked. Emma took a breath of the cold air. It had been 6 weeks since she'd stood outside. She'd forgotten that outside existed as a category distinct from the hospital. "Yeah," she said, "let's go home." It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a resolution of anything. It was just the next true thing, said out loud, in the ordinary air of an ordinary Wednesday morning. They walked to the car. Ethan did fall asleep on the drive home. Emma had predicted it, and he delivered on the prediction with the precision of someone who had never made an empty promise in his 5 months of life. Ryan drove. Emma sat in the back with Ethan's car seat, not because she'd planned to, but because when they'd gotten to the car, she'd looked at the rear door and then looked at Ryan and he'd said, without discussion, "Go ahead," understanding what she needed before she'd finished knowing it herself. She sat beside her son and watched him sleep for the 23 minutes it took to get from St. Catharines to the Riverside District apartment, and she did not count his breaths. She noticed this, the not counting, and held it carefully, the way you hold a thing that might be fragile. The apartment was the same as she'd left it 6 weeks ago. Of course it was. Apartments don't reorganize themselves around your absence. But it felt different, re-entered after what they'd all been through, smaller than she remembered, and more real, and full of the particular accumulated texture of the life she'd been building in it. The east-facing nursery, the monitor on the dresser, the precise angle of the crib mattress that she'd set months ago, and that no one had disturbed. Ryan carried Ethan's car seat in. He stood in the doorway of the nursery and looked at it with the expression of a man visiting a place he'd heard described but never seen, which was accurate. He'd never been here. He'd been in the hospital, in the consultation rooms, in the corridors Emma had learned from the inside, but he'd never been in the place where her actual life was, where she'd managed the months before the hospitalization, where she'd stood at the east window in the mornings because morning light was good for newborns, and she'd held on to that small, controllable thing. "This is a good room," he said. "The window faces east," she said. "Morning light." "Yeah." He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that didn't need words, and they both let it pass. She took Ethan from the carrier and put him in the crib, and he resettled without waking, and she stood over him for a moment with her hand on his back. The monitor was on. The readings were what they should be. He was home. Ryan stood in the doorway, and Emma was aware of him the way she'd been aware of him all through these weeks, as a presence with weight and dimension that she couldn't pretend wasn't there, that she'd stopped wanting to pretend wasn't there sometime around the 2nd week of recovery, though she hadn't admitted that to anyone, including herself. "You should probably go," she said. "Get some sleep. You look like I feel." "I'm all right." "Ryan." I know. He looked at Ethan one more time. "I'll call tomorrow morning?" "Call tomorrow morning," she said. He left, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs. She knew them now. She knew the exact weight and pattern of them. And she stood in the nursery in the quiet and breathed. Then she went and made herself a proper meal for the first time in 6 weeks, and ate it at her own kitchen table. And it tasted like nothing remarkable, and she was grateful for every bite of it. The 6 months that followed were not a straight line. Emma had known they wouldn't be, had told Ryan they wouldn't be, had told herself the same thing. But knowing a thing and living inside it are different operations, and there were days when the difference was significant. Ethan's post-transplant care was demanding in the specific way that chronic medical management is demanding. Not crisis, not emergency, but the relentless ongoing attention of someone who cannot afford to let their guard down entirely. The medications were precise and time-sensitive. The monitoring appointments were frequent. There were 2 rejection scares in the first 3 months, both managed, both resolved, both leaving behind the particular residue of fear that doesn't fully clear after the immediate threat does. The first rejection scare happened in the 8th week post-discharge, a Tuesday in January, when Ethan's follow-up blood work came back with elevated markers that Dr. Nguyen called Emma about immediately. Emma had been at the apartment when the call came. She called Ryan before she'd finished the conversation with Dr. Nguyen, which she recognized in the split second she was doing it as a significant thing. She'd made it reflex, the calling of him, had done it without having to decide. He met her at the hospital. They adjusted Ethan's immunosuppressants. They watched for 48 hours. The markers came down. "Doctor," Nguyen said cautiously, satisfied again, with the specific restraint Emma had come to understand was her way of saying, "This is good, but I'm not going to let myself feel it fully until it holds." Emma understood that quality. She had developed it herself somewhere in the first months of all this as a survival mechanism. You could not afford to fully land on good news in a situation like Ethan's because the news could turn again. And if you'd let yourself fully land, you had farther to fall. Ryan drove them home from that 48-hour watch. Ethan was in the back in his car seat. It was late, 10-something, the city quieting into its nighttime version, and Ryan drove with the same deliberate steadiness with which he'd been approaching all of it since the beginning. And Emma sat in the passenger seat this time, because they'd stopped doing the dance of who sat where around the car seat. It just happened organically now, and she looked out the window at the city going past. "Can I ask you something?" Ryan said. "Yeah." "Do you ever sleep now?" "Actually sleep." She thought about it. "More than before. There are still nights." She looked at him. "You?" "Some nights." He kept his eyes on the road. "I wake up and think about the monitors. Run the numbers in my head." "That'll ease," she said. "It does, eventually. The vigilance recalibrates." "Does it go away?" "No." She was honest because he'd asked for honest. "It becomes background instead of foreground." "But it doesn't go away." He nodded, absorbing this without resistance. "Ryan," she said. "Yeah. You're doing well. With all of this, I want to say that directly since I'm not always good at saying things directly." He glanced at her. Something in his expression did the thing it had been doing lately. That shift she'd come to recognize as him receiving something he hadn't expected and didn't know quite where to put. "Thank you," he said. "It's not a compliment. It's an observation." "I know. You don't do compliments." "I do compliments," she said. "Just not casually," he said. "You don't do them casually." A pause. "I know. I've been paying attention." She looked at him for a moment. "I've noticed that," she said. He kept his eyes on the road, but she saw him smile. Just a small one, the kind that happens before you've decided to smile. In February, Ryan restructured Blackwell Capital. He didn't announce it dramatically. Emma learned about it the way she'd come to learn most things about his professional life in those months, in pieces, mentioned in passing, without the performance of significance that she'd once associated with how he talked about his work. He told her over dinner in her kitchen one Saturday evening, Ethan asleep in the next room, that he'd brought in a co-managing partner and realigned the firm's operational structure to distribute the day-to-day decision-making he'd been carrying alone for 12 years. "That's a significant change," she said. "It's overdue." He had his hands wrapped around a mug. "I've been running the firm like it would collapse without me in every room. That's not management. It's a personality problem." She looked at him across the table. "Who told you that?" "My attorney. Carol. Dana. Implicitly, the way she looks at me sometimes." He paused. "You, once. Early on, not about the firm specifically, but the principle was the same. I said you were managing fear by making everything a project." "Right." He met her eyes. "Same thing, bigger scale." He looked at his mug. "I've been building a company that required me to be indispensable, because if I was indispensable, I had a reason to be there constantly. And if I was constantly there, I didn't have to be anywhere else. And being anywhere else meant—" He stopped. "Meant what?" she asked. He looked at her. "Meant being with people, in the way that actually being with people requires. Which I was afraid of." Emma was quiet for a moment. The kitchen held its own particular quiet, the good quiet, the inhabited kind, the kind that comes from a space being actually lived in rather than just occupied. "Ryan," she said, "that's a very honest thing to say." "I know. I'm practicing." He looked at his mug again. "It's uncomfortable." "Honesty usually is." "You make it look easy." "I don't, actually. I just do it anyway." She looked at him. "There's a difference." He thought about this. "Yeah," he said. "There is." They ate the rest of the dinner without talking much, in the comfortable way that people eat who have gotten past the point of needing to fill every silence, and Ethan made a sound from the nursery that resolved itself without intervention, and outside the kitchen window the February dark held the city in its ordinary indifference. Emma thought, sitting there, about the dinner tables of their marriage, about how many of them she'd sat through feeling invisible, feeling like a variable that got accommodated, and about how this dinner table, in her small kitchen in the Riverside District apartment on a Saturday night in February, felt nothing like those tables. Not because Ryan had become a different person. He hadn't, not exactly. He was still the same architecture, direct, efficient, inclined toward information gathering in moments of uncertainty, uncomfortable with the kind of emotional exposure that couldn't be organized into actionable steps. He was still going to check his phone sometimes when she needed him to look at her. He was still going to default to project mode when he was afraid, until he caught himself doing it. But he was catching himself doing it, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole difference. Okay. April brought Ethan's 6-month post-transplant assessment, and Dr. Nguyen sat across from them in her office, photographs still slightly turned toward the wall, old habit, and said, with the restraint she always used before she felt certain, that Ethan's cardiac function was better than the projected range for this point in recovery. Better, Emma said. Meaningfully better. Dr. Nguyen allowed herself something that was almost a smile. His new heart is performing well. His rejection markers are at baseline. He is, by the measurements that matter, a thriving infant. Emma looked at Ryan. He was looking at the desk. He's going to have a long road of monitoring ahead, Dr. Nguyen continued. This is not a discharge from care. It's a transition to long-term management. But I want you to hear clearly, the prognosis today is good, genuinely good. Ryan looked up. He cleared his throat once. Thank you, he said, and his voice had the quality it had in the elevator on the discharge day, rough, in a way she'd never heard from him before all of this. Thank you, Emma echoed, and she meant it in the direction of the doctor, but also in the direction of something larger that she didn't have a name for. Not fate, not luck, just the accumulated force of all the things that had aligned, all the hands that had done their precise and careful work. They walked out of the appointment into an April afternoon that was warmer than it had been, the kind of day that feels like permission after a long winter. Emma had Ethan in the carrier against her chest. He was big enough now that the carrier required an upgrade, and he rode in it with the authority of someone who has decided this mode of transport is acceptable. And he was awake and interested in the street, his head turning to follow movement the way it had been turning to follow things for months now, cataloging the world with those gray-green eyes. Ryan walked beside her. He'd taken the diaper bag without being asked, which had become a default, part of the distribution of logistics they'd arrived at, without formally negotiating. He's going to be okay, Emma said. She said it out loud because she needed to say it out loud, to hear it in the air outside her own head. He is, Ryan said. I've been afraid to say it. Felt like saying it out loud would tempt something. I know. I've been doing the same thing. He glanced at her. We can probably stop that now. Probably. They walked half a block in the warm air before Ryan said, Emma. She looked at him. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. On the sidewalk in April, people moving around them with the indifference of pedestrians who have somewhere to be and don't know that this particular piece of sidewalk is significant. I want to say something, he said, and I want to say it clearly because I'm aware I haven't always been clear with you, and I don't want to be unclear about this. She looked at him. Ethan looked at him. I know where we are, Ryan said. I know we've been building something slow, and I know that's the right way to build it, and I'm not asking you to move faster than you want to move. I'm not trying to close a deal. He held her gaze. I just want you to know that what I want, what I actually want, not what I'm managing toward or positioning for, is this, you and Ethan, a life that actually includes both of you, not as accommodated variables, but as the center. He paused. I know I don't have the right to ask for that. I know it has to be earned over time, and I haven't earned all of it yet. But I wanted to say it clearly so you knew what I was working toward. Emma looked at him, standing on the sidewalk in April. She thought about the fundraiser on the rainy November evening. She thought about 4 years of marriage and the year of deterioration that preceded the end of it, and the dinner tables, and the phone, and the watch check. She thought about 3 in the morning in room 14, and Ryan in the corner chair with his jacket over his arm, and I Can Try, and the first verse of a half-remembered song, loosely tuned. She thought about all of it, the whole accumulated weight of the history between them, which was complicated and imperfect, and included real damage that had not fully healed and would not fully heal. Not ever. Not the way things were before the damage, because that's not how damage works. And she thought about this. This sidewalk, this man, this baby on her chest looking at Ryan with the focused attention he brought to everything, as if he was taking notes, as if he'd been watching both of them for months and had formed views. "I know what you're working toward," she said. "I've known for a while." He looked at her. "I'm not ready to call it anything yet," she said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not ready to put a name on whatever this is becoming, because names make things formal, and formal makes me nervous right now." "Okay," he said, "but I'm not—" She looked for the right words and found, as she usually did when it mattered, that the right words were the plain ones. "I'm not opposed to where this is going, and I want you to know that clearly." Something happened in Ryan Blackwell's face that she thought she'd probably always remember. Not relief exactly, and not triumph. Nothing as simple as either of those. More like the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told, not that he can put it down, but that he's heading in the right direction, that the weight has a destination. "Okay," he said again, and this time the word held a different thing. Ethan, between them, made a sound that was edging toward commentary. "He has thoughts," Ryan said. "He always has thoughts," Emma said. They started walking again, the three of them, in the April afternoon, through the city that didn't care and the light that did what it always did regardless of who was standing in it. In June, they moved Ethan's nursery. Not far. Not to a new apartment, not to a new life that looked completely different from the one they'd been living. But Ryan had found an apartment in the same Riverside district, 4 blocks from Emma's, larger, with a second bedroom that got morning light. He'd shown her the listing without pressure on a Wednesday evening over coffee at her kitchen table, just opened his laptop and turned it toward her and said, "What do you think?" She'd looked at it for a long time. "This is 4 blocks away," she said. "Yes." "You'd be 4 blocks away." That was the idea. He looked at her with the directness he'd been practicing and had become genuinely good at. Close enough that the logistics of sharing Ethan's day are real and not theoretical. Far enough that we're not rushing anything. She'd looked at the listing. Morning light in the second bedroom. A kitchen that was larger than her own. A building she'd actually walked past before and thought was nice without knowing she was thinking it. 4 blocks, she said. 4 blocks, he confirmed. She looked at him across her kitchen table, at this man who had been in her life for 9 years in various forms and capacities and who had caused her real harm through the specific failure of his attention, and who had spent the past 8 months doing the harder, slower work of showing up without any guarantee that it would be received. "Okay," she said. So Ryan moved 4 blocks away. Moved. He did it with the efficiency of someone who has resources and knows how to use them, and within a week he'd installed a nursery in the second bedroom. Emma had not been involved in the setup, had made a deliberate choice not to be involved because she understood that he needed to do this one himself, needed to have made something for Ethan with his own decisions and his own hands. When he showed her the room, finished, she'd stood in the doorway and looked at it. It was not perfect. The crib was slightly too close to the window for summer light management. The dresser was taller than practical for a parent who would be reaching into it at 3 in the morning. The mobile above the crib was the kind with overly cheerful primary color animals that Emma would not have chosen. It was also, unmistakably, a room that had been made by someone who was trying. The careful attention to the small things, a monitor positioned correctly, a nightlight at the right level, a changing table thoughtfully angled, was legible in every detail. It was the room of someone who had done his research and made his decisions and put his hands to the work. "The mobile is a lot," Emma said. "I know," Ryan said. "He seemed to like it when I held it up for him. He likes anything that moves. See, that's information I have now." He looked at her sideways. "It's parenting knowledge. I'm accumulating it." She looked at the room. "Move the dresser 6 inches to the left," she said, "and the crib away from the window another foot." "Okay." "Otherwise it's—" She paused. "It's good, Ryan. It's really good." He looked at her with an expression she had a full vocabulary for now. She'd had months to develop it. It was the expression of a man who was still learning how to receive things gracefully, who had spent most of his life deflecting personal feedback either by dismissing it or by immediately converting it into action items, and who was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to just let it land. "Thank you," he said. "Move the dresser," she said, and went back into the hallway, and he moved the dresser. The day that mattered most, or the day that Emma would return to most often in the years after, when she thought about what rebuilding actually looked like from the inside, was not a dramatic day. It was a Sunday in late June, 6 months after Ethan's discharge, 8 months after Ryan had walked past room 14 and stopped. They were in the park 3 blocks from Emma's apartment, the one with the fountain that had been off in November and was running now, the warm season version of itself. Ethan was on a blanket in the grass, on his stomach, doing the work of learning to use his arms to lift himself, which he'd been practicing for weeks with the focused determination of someone who has decided this is the next skill and is not interested in partial credit. He was doing well at it. His head lifted and he looked around at the park with the attentiveness he brought to everything. Emma sat on the blanket beside him. Ryan sat on her other side, leaning back on his hands in the grass, looking at the fountain. Dana had come for the first hour and had gone to meet someone for lunch. She'd looked at the 3 of them on the blanket as she was leaving with an expression that she'd directed at Emma over Ryan's head, which Emma had received and acknowledged with a look of her own that meant, "I know, don't make it a thing." Dana had made it exactly as much of a thing as she always made things with Emma, which was to say she'd pressed her lips together in the way that meant, "You can talk to me when you're ready," and then left them to it. Carol called in the afternoon from Phoenix, the Sunday call that had become their pattern. Emma put her on speakerphone and held the phone so Carol could see Ethan via the camera, and Carol said things to him in the voice she reserved for him, which was different from her regular voice, softer, with a warmth she didn't extend to many people above the age of about 2. Ryan said hello to Carol, and Carol said hello back, and the hello now had the texture of people who have found their way to a functional respect, which is its own kind of thing. At some point in the afternoon, Ethan got tired of tummy time and made his views clear, and Ryan picked him up without hesitation. It was habit now, the picking up, the settling, the adjustment of position until Ethan was comfortable, and held him against his shoulder and walked a small circuit around the blanket. The way they'd both learned that movement helped when Ethan was at that particular edge between awake and ready to sleep. Emma watched them, Ryan moving in a slow circle, Ethan's dark head on his shoulder, those gray-green eyes open and looking at the world from this new altitude. Ryan's hand on Ethan's back, the careful hand, the hand that had learned the correct pressure and the right angle. She thought about what she'd told Ryan in the family consultation room all those months ago. He's not a problem to solve. She thought about Ryan's face when she'd said it, the flash of recognition that he'd quickly managed. She thought about all the ways she'd watched him manage things this year. Manage fear, manage uncertainty, manage the specific helplessness of situations that did not respond to optimization or resources or forward motion. She'd watched him fail at that management and recover and try again, over and over, without the exit that would have been so available to a man in his position. He could have left. He'd have had legal options, access, some defined role that he could have performed from a comfortable distance, fitting Ethan into the margins the way she'd feared he would. That version had been available to him. He hadn't taken it. That meant something. Not everything. It didn't erase the years of the marriage or the dinner tables or the watch check on the night she'd needed him to look at her. It didn't mean the work was done or that either of them was finished making mistakes. But it meant something real, something that Emma had spent a long time believing Ryan Blackwell was not capable of. The willingness to be changed by something, to let a thing matter enough that it rearranged you. People talk about change as if it's a decision you make and then implement. Emma had been a nurse long enough to know that's not how it works. Change is not a decision. It's a process. And the process is slow and nonlinear, and sometimes it looks like backsliding, and sometimes it looks like nothing at all. And the only way to know if it's real is to watch it across time, not in moments. She'd been watching. It was real. That didn't mean she knew exactly what shape the future took. She didn't. She couldn't see around the corners of whatever was being built between them, whether it would settle into co-parenting that was warm and functional but contained, or whether it would become something more, something that carried the history between them and the damage and the repair and made something new from all of it. She genuinely didn't know. And she'd spent enough time in the past 8 months with uncertainty not to need that resolved right now. What she knew was this. Ethan was in the park on a Sunday in June with both his parents. His heart was working. The fountain was running. The afternoon light was doing what afternoon light in June does, which is to be generous in a way that only lasts for a particular few hours and that you have to be present for to receive. Ryan came back to the blanket and sat beside her. Ethan had gone to sleep on his shoulder with the efficient suddenness of a 5-month-old who had decided he was done being awake. Ryan sat very still to keep from waking him, the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to do this, and he looked at Emma sideways. "He's out," he said quietly. "He does that?" she said. "Every time." "Every time," she agreed. They sat in the afternoon. The fountain made its sound. In the distance, the city went about its business. "Emma," Ryan said, low enough not to disturb Ethan. "I'm happy." He said it with the slight uncertainty of someone who is making an honest report on an unfamiliar internal state. "I want to note that, because I'm aware I'm not always good at noting things." She looked at him. Then she looked at Ethan, asleep on his shoulder, and at the park around them, and at the afternoon light that didn't have an agenda. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a resolution to all the things that were still complicated between them, because those things were still complicated, because complicated doesn't resolve on a timeline of 8 months. And anyone who tells you it does is selling something. There was still the damage. There were still the conversations they hadn't fully finished, the trust that was real but not yet complete, the version of themselves as partners that they hadn't arrived at and might not arrive at in the form either of them imagined. But there was also this afternoon, this park, this man who had walked past a hospital room and stopped, who had stayed in a corner chair until 6:40-something in the morning, who had moved 4 blocks away and positioned a dresser wrong and gotten the mobile right, who was sitting in June grass with their son asleep on his shoulder, saying, "I'm happy like a man practicing something he'd decided he needed to get better at." There was also Ethan's heart, beating steadily in his chest. Someone else's heart, given in the worst moment of another family's life, now doing its work in Ethan's small body with the profound indifference of hearts to the circumstances around them. Hearts just beat. That's what they do. They beat because that's what they were made for, and they don't require the situation to be resolved or the people around them to have figured everything out. They just keep going, one beat and then another and another, in the ordinary miracle of continuing. Emma had spent months counting Ethan's breaths. She thought about that, about all the counting, all the measuring, all the vigilance that had been the only thing available to her in the absence of control. She understood now, sitting in this park, that the counting had not been useless. It had been love, expressed in the only currency available to a mother sitting in the dark beside a monitor. It had been the physical form of "I am here, I am paying attention, I will not look away." Ryan had learned to count too. In his own way, in the language available to him. The restructured calendar, the face-down phone, the medical texts flagged and studied, the first verse of a half-remembered song. It was the same currency, differently denominated. That was the thing about love that nobody told you when you were young, Emma thought. That it looked different in different people's hands. That it didn't always look the way you'd been told to expect it to look, and sometimes you had to learn to read a different form of it, and sometimes you had to learn to offer it in a form the other person could receive, and both of those learnings were long and imperfect and worth attempting. The afternoon held them in the warm light. Ethan breathed. Ryan stayed still beside her, one hand on their son's back, and Emma leaned her shoulder very slightly against his, just enough, and watched the fountain run. They didn't have everything figured out. They were not going to have everything figured out. They were going to make more mistakes, both of them, in ways they couldn't anticipate yet, because that's what people do. They carry their histories and their habits and their fears into every new place, and those things don't disappear just because the situation changes. But they were here, in the park, in the light, with their son between them. They had chosen to be here on this particular afternoon, which was the only afternoon there was. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, when Emma let herself look at it directly, everything.